Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of the Ozark Mountains. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The year was 1939, and autumn had descended upon the Ozarks with unusual ferocity. The leaves had turned earlier than expected, their rusty hues bleeding across the landscape like a warning. Locals around Phelps County, Missouri, spoke of how the birds had departed weeks before they normally would. Old-timers claimed it was going to be an exceptionally harsh winter, one of those that tested the mettle of even the most resilient mountain folk. They had no idea that nature's peculiar behavior was perhaps the least unsettling thing that would occur that season. The Rogers family had moved to the secluded valley nestled between the rolling hills of the Ozarks in 1937. Harrison Rogers, a stern-faced man with weathered hands and a perpetual furrow in his brow, had purchased a modest parcel of land with a weathered farmhouse atop a gentle hill overlooking Crooked Creek. The property had stood empty for nearly 8 years before the Rogers arrived. Local records showed the previous owners, the Whitaker family, had abandoned it rather suddenly, leaving behind most of their possessions. The county clerk's sparse notes indicated they had departed under distressed circumstances, though no further explanation was provided. Harrison's wife, Adelaide, was a slender, quiet woman with prematurely silver hair that she kept fastidiously pinned back. She rarely ventured into the nearby town of Rolla, preferring instead to tend to the small garden she had cultivated behind the house. The couple was joined by Harrison's older brother, Virgil, a bachelor who had lost his right eye in an industrial accident some years prior. Virgil was known for his long periods of silence punctuated by outbursts of peculiar observations that often left listeners unsettled. The family kept to themselves, which wasn't particularly unusual for newcomers to the area. The Ozarks had long been a place where people came to disappear, to escape whatever troubled them in the outside world. The dense forests and hidden valleys provided both sanctuary and isolation in equal measure. According to accounts from the local general store owner, Elias Morrow, the Rogers made infrequent trips for supplies, paying in cash and speaking only when necessary. They weren't unfriendly, Morrow would later recall in a 1962 interview preserved in the Missouri Historical Society archives, just separate somehow, like they were living in a different world from the rest of us. Harrison would ask about the weather, about crop prices, normal things. But there was always something in their eyes, all of them, like they were watching for something none of us could see. By the autumn of 1939, the Rogers family had been in residence for just over 2 years. They had established a modest existence, raising chickens and growing enough vegetables to sustain themselves through the winter months. Harrison occasionally took odd jobs in town, primarily carpentry work, for which he showed considerable skill. However, as September gave way to October, several townspeople reported a change in his demeanor. Rosalind Chambers, who ran the local post office, noted in her personal journal, discovered among her effects after her death in 1957. Rogers came in today to mail a letter. Address was to someone in Jefferson City. Couldn't make out the name. His hands were shaking something terrible. When I asked if he was feeling well, he just stared at me with the strangest look, like he couldn't quite place who I was. Then he said, "It's getting closer every day." When I asked what was, he just shook his head and left without another word. This wasn't the only documented instance of Harrison's increasingly erratic behavior. The town doctor, Marcus Williams, recorded in his patient logs that Harrison had visited twice in early October, complaining of insomnia. Patient reports inability to sleep due to persistent sounds around the property, Williams wrote, described as scratching on the walls and footsteps on the roof. Prescribed mild sedative. Patient exhibited signs of extreme exhaustion and possible paranoia. recommended rest, and perhaps a visit from the local minister. It was around this time that Harrison Rogers commissioned the town's only photographer, Spencer Fulton, to come to the property and take a family portrait. Fulton, who had operated a modest photography studio in Rolla since 1926, was known for his technically precise work and unobtrusive manner. According to Fulton's business ledger, Harrison paid him double his usual rate to come to the Rogers property at a very specific time, exactly 4:17 p.m. on October 21, 1939. The peculiarity of this request was noted by Fulton in the margins of his appointment book. Rogers, insistent on exact time, asked 3 times if my watch was accurate. Unusual client behavior. The day of the photograph was, by all meteorological records, unseasonably cold. The county weather station recorded a temperature of 38 degrees Fahrenheit, with a thick blanket of fog that had settled over the valleys that morning and refused to burn off even as afternoon approached. Fulton's handwritten notes, discovered in a box of his personal effects after his death in 1968, described the atmosphere at the Rogers property. Arrived at 4:05 p.m. Property has deteriorated since I last passed by it in summer. Garden overgrown, chicken coop empty. Front door was open upon my arrival, though no one visible. House silent. Waited on porch until exactly 4:15, then knocked. Harrison appeared immediately, as if he'd been standing just inside the door. His appearance was unkempt, beard grown out, clothes stained. He did not speak, merely nodded, and led me to the back of the house. Adelaide and Virgil were already seated in 2 chairs placed precisely at the edge where the yard meets the tree line. 3rd chair empty, presumably for Harrison. Background was dense forest, now mostly bare branches, creating an effect like skeletal fingers clawing at the sky. As I set up my equipment, none of the family spoke. Adelaide's hands were folded in her lap, knuckles white. Virgil stared at a fixed point in the distance, occasionally mouthing words I couldn't make out. Most unsettling portrait session of my career. At exactly 4:17, Harrison took his seat. I took 3 exposures in quick succession. On the final exposure, a strong gust of wind came from the forest, cold enough to make my eyes water. Harrison immediately stood, declared, "It's done," and handed me payment in cash. Before I had even packed my equipment, all 3 had gone back inside the house. The door shut firmly behind them. Fulton developed the photographs the following day. The first 2 exposures showed nothing unusual, just 3 grim-faced individuals seated stiffly before a backdrop of barren trees. It was the 3rd and final photograph, the one taken at precisely 4:17 p.m., that would become the subject of decades of scrutiny and speculation. In this image, known now simply as the last Rogers photograph, something appears in the tree line directly behind the family. Most descriptions refer to it as a distortion or anomaly, though these clinical terms fail to capture the visceral unease the image provokes in viewers. The area in question is a roughly oval shape, approximately the size of an adult human, positioned between 2 prominent trees behind Virgil Rogers' right shoulder. Within this area, the bare branches and trunks of the forest appear to bend and warp, as if viewed through rippling water or distorted glass. Some observers have claimed to see a face within this distortion, though no 2 descriptions of this face are identical. The most disturbing element of the photograph, however, is not the anomaly itself, but the family's posture. While in the previous 2 exposures they faced forward, in this final image all 3 have turned their heads exactly 45 degrees to the left, their expressions transformed from mere solemnity to what multiple observers have described as absolute terror. Adelaide's mouth is open in what appears to be a silent scream, while Harrison's hands grip the armrests of his chair with such force that his knuckles appear bloodless in the black and white image. Most unnervingly, Virgil's single eye is wide with an emotion that defies simple categorization. What happened to the Rogers family after this photograph was taken remains one of the most perplexing aspects of the case. According to county records, they continued to reside at the property until at least December 1939. The last documented interaction with any family member comes from a delivery receipt signed by Adelaide on December 8th for a shipment of winter provisions from Morrow's General Store. After this date, there is no official record of the Rogers family's presence in Phelps County, or, indeed, anywhere else. They did not sell their property, file for a change of address, or notify any local authorities of their intention to relocate. Their disappearance might have gone unnoticed for longer had it not been for an unusual weather event in early January 1940. On January 4th, after 3 days of heavy snowfall, Elias Morrow became concerned that the Rogers family might be running low on supplies. He convinced the local sheriff, Thomas Blackburn, to accompany him to the property to check on their welfare. What they discovered was documented in Blackburn's official report, filed on January 5, 1940, arrived at Rogers' property at approximately 11:20 a.m. No signs of recent activity, no footprints in snow, no smoke from chimney, front door unlocked. Upon entry, discovered house in state of disarray, consistent with hasty departure. Food still on kitchen table, partially consumed. Coffee pot on stove, burned dry. Personal belongings, including clothing, still present. Most unusual was discovery of walls in main sitting room. Every available surface covered with same symbol, drawn repeatedly in what appears to be charcoal. Symbol resembles elongated figure 8 or infinity sign with small markings at cardinal points. Dr. Williams' call to scene suggested possible mental disturbance. No signs of violence or struggle observed. No tracks leading from house in any direction despite undisturbed snow. Missing persons report filed. Investigation ongoing. The investigation into the Rogers family's disappearance continued sporadically for several months before being classified as an unsolved case. No bodies were ever discovered, no evidence of foul play established, and no sightings of Harrison, Adelaide, or Virgil were ever confirmed. The property remained abandoned, eventually reverting to county ownership due to unpaid taxes. It was finally sold at auction in 1946 to a cattle farmer who raised the existing structures, claiming they were too far gone to salvage. The symbol described in Sheriff Blackburn's report became a point of particular interest in subsequent investigations. Dr. Marcus Williams, who had been called to the scene, made a rough sketch of it in his personal journal. The drawing shows an elongated figure 8 or infinity symbol with small marks at what Williams labeled the cardinal points, north, south, east, and west. Williams noted that the symbol appeared to have been drawn with manic precision, each iteration nearly identical to the others despite covering surfaces including walls, ceilings, and even the glass of picture frames. In my medical opinion, Williams wrote, the creation of these symbols would have required many hours of concentrated effort. The consistency and precision suggest a mind fixated to the point of obsession, yet paradoxically, a steady hand and clear purpose. This is not the random scrawling of a disturbed mind, but something deliberate and methodical. Most troubling is that if the Rogers family created these markings, as seems likely, they would have had to work continuously for several days, possibly without sleep, to complete so many. A significant development in the case came in 1942 when a surveyor named Joseph Merrick discovered an unusual configuration of stones while mapping an area approximately 3 miles from the Rogers property. Arranged in a perfect circle about 8 feet in diameter, the stones were of varying sizes but positioned with remarkable precision. At the center of this circle was a larger, flat stone bearing a crude carving that Merrick immediately recognized as matching the symbol described in the Rogers case. Merrick, having heard rumors about the Rogers disappearance, reported his finding to Sheriff Blackburn. By the time authorities reached the location 2 days later, however, the stone circle had been disturbed. The central stone with the carving was missing, and the remaining stones appeared to have been scattered randomly. Despite a thorough search of the surrounding area, the carved stone was never recovered. What makes this incident particularly strange is that the location where Merrick discovered the stone circle was deep in a densely wooded area, with no trails or roads nearby. According to his report, reaching the site required navigating through nearly impassable underbrush. When questioned about how the stones could have been moved or taken in such a short time, Merrick had no explanation, stating only that he was certain of what he had seen and of the precise location. This was not the only instance of the mysterious symbol appearing in the area. Throughout the 1940s, several local residents reported finding the figure 8 marking carved into trees along remote hiking paths or scratched into the dirt at crossroads. These incidents were sporadic and widely dispersed, leading some to dismiss them as copycat act, inspired by the growing local legend of the Rogers family. However, a pattern emerged that seemed difficult to attribute to mere coincidence. The markings would appear most frequently in October, often around the anniversary of the Rogers photograph. They were typically discovered in the early morning, with no evidence of who might have created them overnight. Perhaps most unsettling, they often appeared in locations that would have been difficult to access in darkness, such as high on tree trunks or in the middle of open fields, where any approaching person would have been visible from a considerable distance. In 1947, a folklorist from the University of Arkansas named Evelyn Crawford became interested in the Rogers case while researching regional superstitions. Crawford interviewed numerous residents of Phelps County, collecting accounts not only of the Rogers disappearance, but of other unusual occurrences in the area's history. Her findings, published in the Journal of American Folklore under the title Patterns of Disappearance, a study of Ozark anomalies, suggested something that previous investigators had overlooked. The Rogers case, Crawford wrote, appears at first to be isolated and unique. However, when placed within the broader context of local history, a disturbing pattern emerges. County records indicate that between 1875 and 1939, no fewer than 7 families disappeared under similar circumstances from within a 15-mile radius of what would later become the Rogers property. In each case, the disappearance occurred in autumn or early winter. In each case, the family had lived in the area for less than 5 years, and in each case, there were reports of increasingly unusual behavior in the weeks preceding the disappearance. Crawford's research revealed that these earlier cases had received little attention, partly due to the remote nature of the region and partly because, prior to the Rogers incident, no formal investigation had been conducted. Most had been attributed to families simply moving on, a common enough occurrence in the economically challenging environment of the rural Ozarks. What distinguished the Rogers case was the photograph, tangible evidence that something truly unusual had occurred. Crawford became particularly interested in Spencer Fulton's account of the photography session and sought him out for an interview in early 1948. Their conversation, recorded in Crawford's field notes, added several disturbing details not included in Fulton's original statement. I asked Mr. Fulton about the exact moment he took the final photograph, Crawford wrote. He became visibly agitated, insisting that he had told the authorities everything. When I pressed him about what he might have witnessed that wasn't in his official statement, he was silent for a long time before responding. "There was something moving in the trees," he finally said. "Just before I took that last exposure, not like an animal or the wind, more like the trees themselves were moving, bending toward the family, and there was a sound, not loud, but I've never heard anything like it before, or since, a sort of humming, but with words in it somehow, though I couldn't make them out." When I asked why he hadn't included these details in his statement to Sheriff Blackburn, Fulton said, "Because he would have thought I was crazy, and because sometimes I think if I don't speak about it, Maybe it didn't really happen. Maybe I imagined it. He then refused to discuss the matter further. Crawford's attempts to locate the original photograph proved unsuccessful. Fulton claimed to have given the only prints to the sheriff's department, and the negatives had been destroyed in a small fire in his studio in 1941, a fire that investigative records described as of unknown origin, despite being confined to the single drawer where the Rogers negatives were stored. The sheriff's department, meanwhile, reported that their copy of the photograph had been misfiled and could not be located. Crawford noted with some frustration that she was unable to find anyone who acknowledged having seen the actual photograph, despite its central role in the case and the numerous descriptions of it in circulation. "I am left with the unsettling impression," Crawford concluded in her notes, "that the photograph itself has vanished as completely as the family it depicted." Crawford's investigation took an unexpected turn when she discovered a journal allegedly belonging to Adelaide Rogers in the collection of a local antiques dealer. The dealer claimed it had been among items purchased at an estate sale following the death of Dr. Marcus Williams, though he could not explain how Williams had come to possess it. The journal, covering a period from July to early December 1939, began as a mundane record of daily life, garden plantings, weather observations, household accounts. By September, however, the entries had taken on a more anxious tone. Adelaide wrote of strange sounds in the night, of Harrison's increasing insomnia, and of Virgil's claim that he could see it watching from the trees, even when no one else could. An entry dated October 12th reads, "V refuses to go outdoors after 4 p.m. now. Says that's when it's strongest. H called him superstitious, but has begun checking the locks 3 times each night. Neither will tell me exactly what they fear. I pretend not to notice the changes in the forest, the way the shadows gather differently than they once did. Perhaps if I don't acknowledge it, it will leave us alone." The final entry, dated December 7th, contains only a single line. "H says we must make the symbol everywhere. It's our only protection, now that it's found a way inside." Crawford attempted to authenticate the journal through handwriting comparison with Adelaide's signature on legal documents, but the results were inconclusive. The journal's provenance remained questionable, and some researchers later suggested it may have been a hoax created to capitalize on the enduring interest in the Rogers case. Nevertheless, its contents aligned with known facts and added a perspective that had been missing from the official record. Perhaps the most significant contribution of Crawford's research was her discovery of what appeared to be a much older version of the mysterious symbol associated with the Rogers case. In the archives of the Missouri Historical Society, she found a collection of papers belonging to Jeremiah Kincaid, a missionary who had worked with indigenous communities in the Ozark region during the 1820s. Among Kincaid's papers was a sketch of a symbol he described as a ward against that which walks between the trees. Dabibi, the drawing clearly depicted the same elongated figure 8 with cardinal markings that had been found throughout the Rogers home. Kincaid's accompanying notes described it as an ancient sign known to the eldest members of the tribe, who claim it was taught to their ancestors by a medicine man who had survived an encounter with the Wendigo spirit. According to Kincaid, the symbol was to be drawn around dwelling places when the barrier between worlds grows thin, and was believed to prevent entry by malevolent entities. His notes express skepticism about such heathen superstitions, while acknowledging that the indigenous people he encountered were genuinely terrified of something they believed dwelled in the deepest parts of the forest, something that could take control of a person's mind and compel them to wander into the wilderness, never to return. Crawford's attempt to trace this connection further was hampered by the fragmentary nature of records from that period and by what she described as a growing reluctance among local residents to discuss the matter. Her research notes from late 1948 express increasing frustration with canceled interviews and unanswered correspondence. In February 1949, Crawford abruptly abandoned her project, citing personal reasons. She left the university shortly thereafter and published nothing further on the subject. A colleague who visited Crawford in 1950 reported finding her much changed and unwilling to discuss her previous research. According to this account, Crawford had moved to a small apartment in St. Louis where the walls were covered with copies of the figure 8 symbol. When asked about them, she would only say, "Insurance, just in case it followed me." The Rogers case might have faded into obscurity if not for a series of events that began in the autumn of 1957, nearly 18 years after the family's disappearance. Dr. Lawrence Kellerman, a professor of folklore at the University of Missouri, had become interested in the case while researching a book on Ozark superstitions. Despite the passage of time, he found that the story still resonated strongly with local residents, many of whom were reluctant to discuss it in detail. Kellerman's breakthrough came when he located Spencer Fulton, who was by then retired and living with his daughter in Springfield. Initially reluctant to revisit the subject, Fulton eventually agreed to an interview after Kellerman convinced him of the scholarly nature of his interest. During their conversation, which Kellerman recorded with Fulton's permission, the elderly photographer revealed that, contrary to previous reports, he had retained one copy of the infamous photograph, the first print made from the negative. He had kept it hidden for years, separate from his other work, stored in a metal box that he kept locked in his bedside table. "I told the sheriff I destroyed them all," Fulton admitted. "But I couldn't bring myself to do it, not all of them. A photographer keeps his work, you understand? Even when maybe he shouldn't." Fulton's hands trembled as he retrieved the box and unlocked it. The photograph inside was smaller than Kellerman had expected, just 5 by 7 inches, mounted on stiff cardboard that had yellowed with age. The image itself remained remarkably clear. 3 people seated before a backdrop of winter bare trees, their faces turned at identical angles, expressions contorted in what could only be described as terror. And behind them, just as described in countless second-hand accounts, was the distortion, an area where the orderly pattern of tree trunks and branches seemed to warp and bend, creating what Kellerman later described as a visual echo of something that should not exist. "I've never shown this to anyone," Fulton said. "Not my wife when she was alive, not my daughter. Sometimes I take it out just to make sure it's still there, that I didn't dream the whole thing. And sometimes—" He trailed off, staring at the image with obvious discomfort. "Sometimes what?" Kellerman prompted. "Sometimes I think it changes," Fulton said finally. "Just a little. The way they're looking, their expressions, like they're trying to tell me something. And that thing in the trees. I swear it's clearer now than it was before, like it's coming into focus after all these years." Kellerman asked if he could have the photograph professionally copied for his research. After some hesitation, Fulton agreed with the condition that the original be returned to him immediately afterward. Kellerman promised to handle the matter personally, taking the photograph to a specialized laboratory in St. Louis the very next day. The technician who made the copy commented on the unusual density of the photographic emulsion, noting that it was thicker than typically seen in prints from that era. When Kellerman inquired about what might cause such an anomaly, the technician suggested it could result from multiple exposures on the same negative, a technical error that might also explain the distortion visible in the tree line. This seemingly rational explanation was undermined, however, when the technician called Kellerman back to the lab an hour later. The copy he had made, which had appeared perfect when first developed, had begun to deteriorate in a most unusual manner. The area corresponding to the distortion in the original had become blurred beyond recognition, while the rest of the image remained crisp and clear. "I've never seen anything like it," the technician said. "It's like that part of the image is, I don't know, rejecting the copying process somehow. I can try again, but I can't guarantee better results." Kellerman requested a second attempt with the same outcome. After a third try yielded an even worse result, with the blurred area now expanding to encompass the figures of the Rogers family themselves, he decided to abandon the effort and return the original to Fulton as promised. Upon returning to Springfield, however, Kellerman discovered that Fulton had been hospitalized the previous evening. According to his daughter, she had found him in his room in a state of extreme agitation, repeatedly mumbling about someone at the window despite his bedroom being on the second floor. The attending physician diagnosed a severe anxiety attack, possibly exacerbated by age-related confusion. Fulton remained in the hospital for 3 days, during which time Kellerman visited him twice. On both occasions, the elderly man was sedated and largely unresponsive. Kellerman left the photograph with Fulton's daughter, explaining that her father had lent it to him briefly and would want it returned. She placed it in a drawer without examining it closely, commenting that she had never much cared for Dad's old photographs. 2 days after his release from the hospital, Spencer Fulton was found dead in his home. The coroner determined the cause to be a heart attack, not unusual for a man of his age and general health. What was unusual, according to the police report, was the state of Fulton's bedroom. The furniture had been rearranged to barricade the window, and on every wall, drawn in what appeared to be charcoal from the fireplace, was the same elongated figure 8 symbol associated with the Rogers case. Kellerman, upon learning of Fulton's death, immediately contacted his daughter to express condolences and to inquire as delicately as possible about the photograph. She informed him that she had found the metal box among her father's effects, but that it was empty except for a note in her father's handwriting that read simply, "Destroyed it. Not enough." When Kellerman asked what she thought this might mean, she replied that in his final days, her father had spoken often about things watching from the trees and had become convinced that someone or something was trying to enter the house at night. She attributed these delusions to his deteriorating mental state, though she admitted being unsettled by the symbols found in his room after his death. "Dad was never a superstitious man," she told Kellerman. "He was always so rational, so precise in his thinking. For him to start drawing symbols all over the walls like that, it just wasn't like him at all." The loss of both Spencer Fulton and the original photograph was a significant setback for Kellerman's research. Without tangible evidence, he was left to rely on second-hand accounts and the increasingly fragmentary historical record. Nevertheless, he continued his investigation, focusing particularly on the symbol that connected the Rogers case to both earlier and later incidents. Kellerman's research led him to the papers of Evelyn Crawford, which had been donated to the university archives after her death in 1953. Crawford's notes contained references to Jeremiah Kincaid's missionary accounts from the 1820s, which in turn led Kellerman to explore indigenous legends about the forests of the Ozark region. What emerged from this research was a consistent narrative spanning more than a century. Indigenous oral traditions spoke of thin places in the deep forests where the boundary between the physical world and the spirit realm was permeable. These places were to be avoided, particularly during certain times of the year when the barrier was believed to be at its weakest. European settlers had their own versions of these beliefs, often speaking of widowmakers, locations where inexplicable accidents seemed to occur with unusual frequency, or where hunters would become disoriented and disappear despite their familiarity with the terrain. Over time, these stories evolved into more generalized warnings about certain areas being unwholesome or harboring an unspecified malevolence. The common thread in many of these accounts was the presence of an entity or force that could influence human behavior. compelling people to wander into the wilderness, driving them to madness, or simply causing them to disappear without trace. Protection against this influence came in various forms, but the elongated figure 8 symbol appeared consistently across different cultural traditions, always described as a ward or barrier against intrusion from the spirit world. Kellerman published his preliminary findings in the Journal of American Folklore in 1959, including a detailed description of the Rogers photograph based on his brief examination of it. His article suggested a pattern of disappearances connected to the property, occurring approximately every 10 years, with the Rogers case being only the most well-documented instance of a much older phenomenon. The response to Kellerman's article was immediate and unexpected. Within weeks of publication, he began receiving letters from readers claiming to have experienced unusual phenomena after reading his description of the photograph. These ranged from mild reports of unease and nightmares to more extreme claims of auditory hallucinations, specifically the sound of wind through bare branches, even when indoors or in still air. Most disturbing were 3 separate reports from individuals who claimed to have seen figures resembling the Rogers family standing at the foot of their beds in the middle of the night. In each case, the figures were described as unnaturally still, their heads turned at identical angles, their expressions frozen in terror. All 3 reports came from readers who had no connection to each other and who lived in different states. Kellerman, increasingly concerned about the implications of his research, attempted to retract the article and recall all copies of the journal containing it. However, by then it had been widely distributed to university libraries and private subscribers across the country. In a letter to a colleague dated March 1960, Kellerman expressed his growing discomfort. "I fear I may have unleashed something that would have been better left undisturbed. The pattern of experiences reported by those who have merely read my description of the image cannot be dismissed as mere suggestion or hysteria. There is something in that photograph, something captured either by accident or design, that defies rational explanation. I find myself reluctant to pursue this line of inquiry any further, and have taken to keeping my own notes locked away. Even now I sometimes wake convinced that someone is in my room, watching with the same expression I saw on the Rogers family's faces." In April 1960, Kellerman abruptly resigned his position at the university, citing health concerns. He moved to New Mexico and largely withdrew from academic life, refusing all requests for interviews or further information about the Rogers case. His extensive research notes were donated to the university archives after his death in 1969, with the stipulation that certain materials, including all descriptions of the photograph, be sealed for 50 years. When the seal expired in 2019, researchers discovered that all such descriptions had been removed from Kellerman's files before they were placed in the archive. The only documentation remaining was a series of increasingly agitated journal entries, chronicling Kellerman's growing obsession with what he termed the entity in the trees. The most cryptic of these entries, dated just 3 weeks before his resignation, reads, "It is not confined to the photograph. I understand now why they all disappeared. It comes through when you look too long, when you begin to truly see it, and once it knows you've seen it, it begins to see you too." Over the decades following Kellerman's abandonment of the case, various researchers attempted to pick up where he had left off. Most encountered the same obstacles: missing records, reluctant witnesses, and an absence of tangible evidence. The Rogers photograph, which had never been published or widely circulated, took on an almost mythical status in certain circles, with some questioning whether it had ever existed at all. In 1977, a book about unsolved mysteries of the American Midwest included a chapter on the Rogers case, featuring what the author claimed was a reproduction of the infamous photograph. Photography experts immediately noted inconsistencies that suggested this version was a recreation rather than the original. The distortion in the tree line was visible but appeared artificial, and the expressions of terror described in earlier accounts were notably subdued. The author, when questioned about the image's provenance, admitted that it was an artistic recreation based on descriptions from Kellerman's article and other sources. This reproduction, despite its inauthenticity, became the version most commonly associated with the case in popular culture, appearing in numerous books and articles about unexplained phenomena over the following decades. In 1982, a researcher named Martin Graves claimed to have acquired an original print of the photograph from a former student of Kellerman's. Graves announced his intention to subject the image to rigorous scientific analysis using the most advanced technology available at the time. 2 weeks after this announcement, Graves's home in Kansas City was destroyed in a fire. His body was never recovered from the ruins. Fire investigators noted unusual burn patterns throughout the house, with the most intense damage centered around Graves's study, where the photograph was reportedly kept. According to their report, temperatures in this area reached levels inconsistent with standard household fire accelerants. The case remains officially unsolved. The Rogers property itself changed hands several times in the decades following the family's disappearance. After being razed by the cattle farmer who purchased it at auction in 1946, the land remained largely unused for many years. In 1968, a developer purchased the parcel with plans to build vacation cabins, capitalizing on the growing tourism industry in the Ozarks. Construction began in the spring of 1969 but was plagued by setbacks, equipment failures, unexplained accidents, and high worker turnover. Local laborers familiar with the property's history refused to work at the site, forcing the developer to bring in crews from outside the area. These workers reported unusual experiences, tools disappearing and reappearing in different locations, the sensation of being watched from the tree line, and vivid nightmares that multiple individuals described in nearly identical terms. By the autumn of 1969, construction had fallen far behind schedule. Only 2 cabins had been completed, neither of which had yet been occupied, when the project was abruptly abandoned. The developer, in a brief statement to the local newspaper, cited unforeseen complications and financial considerations. He sold the property at a significant loss to a conservation trust, which designated it as a nature preserve, effectively ensuring that no further development would occur there. Access to the preserve was technically open to the public, but few locals ventured onto the property. Hikers and nature enthusiasts occasionally explored the area, particularly during the summer months, though park rangers noted that visitor numbers dropped precipitously in October and remained low throughout the winter. Perhaps the most disturbing development in the Rogers case came in 1998, when construction workers clearing land for a new highway approximately 20 miles from the original Rogers property uncovered a sealed metal container buried several feet below ground. Inside were 3 sets of human remains, later confirmed through dental records to be Harrison, Adelaide, and Virgil Rogers. The unusual preservation of the bodies led the medical examiner to conclude they had been buried shortly after death, which was estimated to have occurred in early December 1939, consistent with their last known appearance. The cause of death could not be definitively established due to the condition of the remains, though the examiner noted an unusual demineralization of the skeletal structure inconsistent with any known pathology. Most unsettling was the position of the remains. All 3 bodies had been carefully arranged with their heads turned at precisely 45 degrees to the left, the exact same position captured in their final photograph. No other evidence was found at the burial site, and no suspects were ever identified in connection with their deaths. The discovery of the Rogers remains briefly reignited interest in the case, with several journalists and amateur investigators attempting to piece together what might have happened to the family in their final days. Most of these inquiries reached the same impasse as earlier investigations. a fragmentary historical record, missing evidence, and the reluctance of local residents to discuss the matter in detail. One significant development came in 2003 when a retired physician named Howard Reynolds contacted authorities with information about Dr. Marcus Williams, the town doctor who had treated Harrison Rogers and who had been called to the scene when the family's disappearance was discovered. Reynolds, who had purchased Williams's practice after his retirement in 1952, claimed to have found a sealed envelope among old patient files marked Rogers Case, Personal Observations, not for official record. The envelope contained several pages of notes written by Williams in the weeks following the Rogers disappearance. In these notes, Williams described his growing concern about what he had observed at the Rogers home, particularly the mysterious symbols covering the walls. I told Sheriff Blackburn that these markings suggested mental disturbance, Williams wrote, but that was not my true assessment. I have seen the products of disturbed minds many times in my practice, and these symbols were something altogether different. The precision, the consistency, the obvious purpose behind their creation. These suggest not madness, but desperate rationality. These people believed they were in danger, and the symbols were their protection. I cannot bring myself to include in any official statement what I truly suspect, that whatever they feared found them despite their precautions. Williams went on to describe his own research into the symbol, which had led him to similar accounts from other doctors practicing in remote areas of the Ozarks. Several had encountered patients who drew the same elongated figure 8, always associated with fears of something that came from the deep woods or watched from the trees. Most disturbing was Williams's description of what he believed had happened to the Rogers family. Based on the condition of the house and the half-eaten meal on the table, he theorized that they had been in the midst of dinner when something had caused them to flee, or had taken them. The absence of footprints in the snow surrounding the house, which had initially seemed inexplicable, suggested to Williams a more terrifying possibility, that they had not left through any door or window, but had been taken by another route altogether. I hesitate to commit these thoughts to paper, he concluded, for fear of being thought mad myself. But I have practiced medicine in these hills for 30 years, and I have heard too many similar stories to dismiss them entirely. There are things in these old forests that defy modern understanding, things our ancestors knew to fear, though we have forgotten why. I believe the Rogers family encountered such a thing, and I pray that their end was swift. Reynolds, explaining why he had come forward after so many years, admitted that he had initially dismissed Williams' notes as the product of an aging mind, influenced by local superstition. It was only after visiting the site of the Rogers property himself, now part of the nature preserve, that he had begun to reconsider. I went there on a clear day in June, Reynolds told investigators. Just curious, you know. Wanted to see what all the fuss was about. Found the foundation of the old house easily enough. Nothing unusual about the place at first glance, just woods and wildflowers, birds, singing. I was about to leave when I noticed how quiet it had suddenly become. No birds, no insects, nothing. And then I felt it, the sensation of being watched. So intense I couldn't move for a moment. When I finally turned around, there was nothing there. Just the trees. But I swear they looked different somehow, like they'd shifted position while my back was turned. I've never felt anything like it before or since, this certainty that I was not alone, that something was there with me, something that wanted something from me. I left immediately and never went back. But that night, I dreamed of the Rogers family. They were sitting just as described in that photograph, at the edge of the forest, their heads turned at that same angle, and they were trying to tell me something, trying to warn me. That's when I remembered Williams's notes and decided they needed to be part of the official record, no matter how strange they might seem. In 2015, A digital restoration specialist named Rebecca Langford attempted to analyze the 1977 recreation of the Rogers photograph using advanced image processing technology. Despite the image's known inauthenticity, Langford hoped that it might contain elements based on the original that could be enhanced and studied. According to her published report, initial results seemed promising, with previously obscured details beginning to emerge from the distorted area in the tree line. However, during the final processing phase, Langford reported that her equipment experienced catastrophic failure, with all files related to the project becoming irretrievably corrupted. In a peculiar postscript to her report, Langford noted that in the final viewable iteration of the enhanced image, the distortion appeared to have shifted position slightly, moving closer to the edge of the frame. She also reported that for several weeks after the project's failure, she experienced persistent auditory phenomena, resembling the sound of footsteps on the roof of her home. After seeking medical attention for sudden onset insomnia, Langford declined all further requests to work with the image. The most recent chapter in the saga of the Rogers photograph came in 2018, when an anonymous donor provided funding for a historical marker to be placed near the site of the original property. The proposed text for the marker made no mention of the mysterious circumstances surrounding the family's disappearance, referring only to their status as former residents of the area. 3 days before the scheduled installation, the completed marker was stolen from a county storage facility. Security footage showed nothing unusual, except for a 17-minute gap in the recording that coincided with the estimated time of the theft. The marker was never recovered, and no replacement has been commissioned. Today, the land where the Rogers family briefly lived has been reclaimed by the forest. Dense undergrowth covers any trace of human habitation, and few locals can pinpoint the exact location of the property. Those who claim to know its whereabouts are reluctant to visit, citing vague but persistent rumors that the area is unwholesome or not right somehow. Park rangers responsible for the nature preserve report occasional incidents of visitors becoming disoriented in the vicinity of the old Rogers property despite relatively simple terrain. Several hikers have required rescue after wandering off marked trails in that area, and all have described similar experiences: a sudden certainty that they were being followed, combined with an irresistible compulsion to move deeper into the forest. Most of these incidents occur in October, particularly around the anniversary of the Rogers photograph. Park management has taken to subtly discouraging visitors during this period, scheduling trail maintenance or citing weather concerns to temporarily close the sections closest to the old property. Some longtime residents of Phelps County maintain that on certain autumn evenings, particularly in the hour before sunset, when the light slants through the trees at a specific angle, visitors to the area have reported seeing 3 figures seated at the edge of the forest, their backs to observers, their heads turned at an identical angle, as if watching something move among the trees. These sightings are dismissed by authorities as local legend embellished over time. Yet it remains curious that, despite the area's popularity with hikers and nature enthusiasts during most of the year, it is notably deserted throughout the month of October. When asked about this phenomenon, even skeptical locals tend to shrug and say simply, "That's just not a good time to be in those woods." In 2020, a footnote to the case emerged with the discovery of a personal journal belonging to Sheriff Thomas Blackburn among the effects of his granddaughter. The journal, covering the period from 1938 to 1942, contained several entries related to the Rogers investigation that had not been included in official reports. Most notable was an entry dated January 6, 1940, the day after Blackburn's official report on the condition of the Rogers home. Found something etched into the wall behind where the photograph hung in the sitting room. Almost missed it, faint as it was. Simple words, carved with what looked like a knife point. "It follows the image." Don't know what to make of that. Chose not to include in official report. Some things better left unrecorded. A later entry, dated October 21st, 1940, exactly 1 year after the Rogers photograph was taken, described Blackburn's return to the property. Went back today, don't know why exactly. Something drawing me there, house exactly as we left it, but something changed. The symbols on the walls, they've shifted somehow. Still the same figure 8 shape, but the lines are deeper, like someone's been maintaining them. But that's impossible. Place has been empty all year. Spent longer there than I meant to. Found myself standing at the edge of the yard, right where Rogers and his family sat, for that photograph. Strangest feeling came over me, like something was watching from the trees. Turned to look, and for a second, no. Won't write it down. Won't give it that power. Not coming back here. Some places should just be left alone. Blackburn never returned to the property, according to subsequent journal entries. He retired from his position as sheriff in 1943 and moved to Arizona, where he lived until his death in 1957. His granddaughter reported that he rarely spoke of his time in law enforcement and refused to discuss the Rogers case at all, changing the subject whenever it was mentioned. The final page of Blackburn's journal contained a rough sketch of the figure 8 symbol associated with the case, surrounded by what appeared to be additional protective markings. Beneath it, in shaky handwriting that differed notably from the rest of the journal, was written, "In case it followed me here, the Rogers photograph continues to fascinate and disturb those who encounter its story. Descriptions of the image occasionally surface in obscure publications or specialized online forums dedicated to unexplained phenomena, though they are often quickly removed, reportedly due to copyright claims from unidentified parties. Those who study such phenomena note a curious pattern. Detailed descriptions of the photograph tend to spread rapidly before disappearing from public view, as if some unseen force were working to contain knowledge of the image. Several researchers have reported difficulty maintaining digital records related to the case, citing unusual file corruptions and data loss specific to their Rogers research. Some paranormal investigators suggest that the photograph itself was merely a catalyst, a moment when whatever dwells in the deep forests of the Ozarks briefly intersected with our reality in a way that could be captured and preserved. They theorize that the image serves as a kind of portal or connection, allowing this entity to extend its influence beyond its natural boundaries. More skeptical analysts point to the power of suggestion and the human tendency to create patterns from random information. They note that many elements of the Rogers story follow classic urban legend structures, with detail shifting and evolving over time to create a more compelling narrative. The absence of the original photograph, they argue, allows each person to imagine their own version of the image, invariably more disturbing than any actual photograph could be. What remains undisputed is the enduring power of the Rogers case to unsettle and disturb. Even those who approach it from a strictly rational perspective often report a lingering unease, a subtle but persistent feeling that somehow, by merely engaging with the story, they have opened themselves to something beyond ordinary experience. Perhaps the true legacy of the Rogers photograph lies not in what it reveals, but in what it suggests about the boundaries between the seen and unseen world. In those shadows among the trees, in that inexplicable distortion captured on aging film, we confront the possibility that some things remain beyond our understanding, that sometimes, when we look too deeply into the darkness, we might discover that something is looking back. The sealed records of Dr. Kellerman's final research are scheduled for release in 2025. Until then, the Rogers family remains frozen in time, eternally seated at the edge of the forest, their expressions locked in that moment of terrible recognition as they turned as one, toward something only they could see. One of the most unsettling aspects of the Rogers case is how it continues to affect those who investigate it deeply. Multiple researchers over the decades have reported similar phenomena after extended study of the case: insomnia, heightened anxiety, and the persistent feeling of being observed when alone. Many have abandoned their research abruptly, often refusing to discuss their reasons. Dr. Amelia Blackwood, a paranormal researcher who attempted to document these patterns in 2012, conducted interviews with 17 individuals who had studied the Rogers case in depth. 14 reported experiencing at least one episode of what Blackwood termed acute environmental awareness, a sudden, overwhelming certainty that they were not alone in what should have been an empty room. What's particularly interesting, Blackwood wrote, is the consistency of these experiences across individuals with no prior knowledge of each other's reports. Multiple subjects described waking at night with the certainty that someone was standing at the foot of their bed. When pressed for details about this presence, many used nearly identical language. It wasn't really a person. It was more like the absence of a person, a space where something should be but isn't quite. Blackwood's research was never published. 6 months into her project, she withdrew from academic life entirely, moving to a remote area of Alaska where, according to former colleagues, she refuses all contact with anyone connected to her previous work. In 2016, a team of environmental scientists conducting a survey of the nature preserve that now encompasses the Rogers property made an unusual discovery. While taking soil samples approximately 50 yards from the site of the original farmhouse, they uncovered a small metal container buried about 18 inches below the surface. Inside was a single item, a silver pocket watch, its hands frozen at 4Jeep 17. The watch was later identified as belonging to Spencer Fulton, the photographer who had taken the infamous Rogers photograph. According to his daughter, Fulton had reported the watch missing shortly after his visit to the Rogers property in 1939, assuming he had dropped it somewhere along the road. How it came to be buried on the Rogers property, and why its hands had stopped at the exact time the photograph was taken, remains unexplained. Perhaps most disturbing was the condition of the watch itself. Despite having been buried in damp soil for over 7 decades, it showed no signs of corrosion or damage. The lead scientist who examined it noted that the metal appeared to have been preserved in a way that defies conventional explanation, adding that the temperature of the watch was notably colder than ambient, even after hours in a climate-controlled laboratory. 2. The watch was sent to a specialized facility for further study but disappeared in transit. The shipping company's tracking system showed the package arriving at its destination, but the receiving facility had no record of it. The investigation into its disappearance was eventually closed without resolution. The enduring power of the Rogers case lies partly in what it represents, the fragility of human certainty when confronted with the vast, ancient wilderness of the Ozarks. This region, with its deep valleys and hidden hollows, has always existed somewhat apart from the march of progress, preserving within its forests something primal and unknowable. As one local historian observed, the Rogers weren't the first to disappear in these hills, and they won't be the last. There are places in the deep woods where the modern world feels very far away and very thin. Our ancestors understood this. They knew there were certain areas you didn't build on, certain times of year when you stayed close to home after dark. We've forgotten much of that wisdom, but the woods, they remember. Today, the Rogers case exists primarily as a cautionary tale, a reminder that some mysteries are perhaps better left unexplored. The photograph that started it all may be lost to history, but its impact continues to ripple through time, touching all who encounter its story with a whisper of unease, a momentary glimpse into something beyond ordinary understanding. Those who visit the Ozarks often report a sense of being watched from the trees, particularly in the more remote areas. Most dismiss this as a natural response to the isolation of deep forests. But for those familiar with the Rogers case, Such moments carry a deeper significance, a reminder that perhaps, in those quiet woods, something still waits, watching through the trees, patient and eternal. And somewhere, perhaps in an archive or forgotten box or buried metal container, the original photograph might still exist, that captured moment when three people turned as one to face something emerging from the trees, their faces frozen in recognition of what was coming for them and what has been looking for them through their image ever since.